الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وهو حبيبنا وقدوتنا وإمامنا ونحن مأمورون عن طريق القرآن أن نصلي ونسلم عليه. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. أما بعد. In this khutbah we wanted to continue to reflect upon Surat al-Hajj, and specifically we also wanted to point to the model of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam and building community, because these 10 days, as we know, these are the days of Dhul Hijjah, the days of the Hajj season. And I wanted to remind everyone and encourage myself and others that the day of Arafah is coming. And the day of Arafah for us is a day in which we supplicate Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, another chance by which we gain forgiveness from Allah. So we invite the community to fast as a jama'ah, or fast together, or as families, or as friends. But to remember that day and to increase your dua or your supplication or your prayers in that day, and also remember me in that day. Surat al-Hajj. Last time we talked about this surah, and we mentioned that the ulama, they had a number of different opinions, but some said that it was a surah that was revealed in between the time period of Mecca and Medina. Without getting into the technicalities of that, I'll repeat the benefit of that. When you know if a surah is revealed in Mecca, it gives you an understanding of the themes and the topics, or let's say ayat. And when you know that other ayat are revealed in Medina, it lets you understand what was going on in the context. Most of the time, as a general rule, anything that's talking about the unseen or the principles of belief, encouraging reflections on the hereafter, on the oneness of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, on the reward for good deeds, usually these types of ayat are revealed in Mecca. And when we come across ayat which talk about rules, halal, haram, inheritance, business transactions, such as prohibition of riba, marriage, that type of thing, usually anything pertaining to rules is revealed in Medina. Interestingly enough, the legislation or the obligation to Salah came at the end period of the Muslims being in Mecca, right before they were forced out. We mentioned before too that this surah was revealed at the last stage of Mecca, and this was the height or the peak of persecution of the Muslims. They were forced out of their countries. Sorry, I was thinking about the people that died recently as refugees. May Allah except them all as shuhada. Some of them were from Pakistan, some of them were from other places. They were leaving their lands looking for life, and they ended up dying at sea. But the reality of hijrah is a reality that's there. They were forced out of their lands, just like people are forced out of their lands today. And they went to Medina. They went to Medina. And so in this period, we begin to see that the Quran, especially in Surat al-Hajj, it becomes very clear that there's an address to humanity as a whole. And there's a number of ayat, interestingly enough, in Surat al-Hajj, which begin with Ya Ayyuhan Nas. And what that means is, oh you people, oh humanity. And then at the same time, you begin to find that the Quran is addressing not only the disbelievers, but the people of the book. The people of the book. And in this surah, one of the things that is made allowable is the right for the Muslim community to defend itself. Because by this time period, after years of persecution and suffering and so on and so forth, when the Muslims are migrating to Medina, they still are not free from the threat of Quraysh itself. One of the things that we have to understand about the Hajj is that the Hajj itself and the idea of al-Haram, which some of the ulama say encompasses part of Muzdalifah, some of them say it encompasses all of Muzdalifah. But we know in Hajj is a place and a time period in which there's no fighting allowed. There's no killing allowed. There's no abuse allowed. And this exemplifies the highest level of the Muslim character and how we think about dealing with each other. The same thing is the reality of Mecca at that time. It was a reality which Mecca was a place where those things didn't exist. The peace and the tranquility and the security that's necessary in order for people to flourish. Not just survive, but for people to flourish. So that's why they were forced to go to Medina. There's a lot of reflections upon this people. Of those reflections, we have to always ask ourselves this point. What are the ingredients for life? What are the ingredients for life? And of those ingredients for life is not only food and drink, but we also need a great degree of security. We also need economic stability. We also need to be in a situation where there's trust. Those qualities and those characteristics, we as Muslims believe can only be maintained in the long run when people worship Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Because we see these qualities, they can be maintained to a certain degree in any place by any people. But once immorality or al-fasad begins to overpower a people, then that people itself will turn to destroy its own security, its own well-being, its own family structure, its own sense of identity. So one of the things that Surat al-Hajj begins with, is the idea of Ya ayyuhan nasu ittaqu rabbakum inna zalzalata as-sa'a shay'un 'azim. Here the address of the Quran is for all of humanity. Addressing humanity that the zilzala, in this case, the earthquake. In other words, what do we think about when we think about an earthquake? What do we think happens in the environment? What do we think happens with the people? The Quran is warning us about a time period in which life on earth will come to a pause and human beings will come to account. And that time period is great. It will overturn everyone's existence. It will be a time period in which the most pious of us will feel fear, knowing that the reality on that day is that there's only one power, knowing that on that day we all come to account. And that's the true sense of Maliki Yawmuddin. We recite that Surat al-Fatiha. And so here, the reality that life itself doesn't stop with going into the grave, but that account, is that we have to give to Allah is a reality. That should make us responsible as human beings on the earth. But the heart that's sick, and that's what Surat al-Hajj continues to talk about. One of the things that's amazing about Surat al-Hajj is the consciousness that it raises, the thinking. It forces us to, you know how the concept we have on computers nowadays, zoom in and zoom out, or even, for instance, we have on our cell phones, we have the ability to zoom over a region. We can see that region. It has buildings, it has water, it has trees, or you can see that knocking down the tree. With this surah allows us to zoom out and look at humanity as a whole. It's almost as if the Quran is calling us to reflect, say, hold on, pause for a moment, and look at what is going on earth. Look at the types of people that are on earth. The Quran is creating a typology. There's this type of person and this type of person on earth. Then the Quran is laying down what are the principles for scientific understanding. We're not talking about scientific understanding like in the laboratory. We're talking about a principle, methodological understanding, which it can encompass what goes on in the laboratory. Look at life itself. Look at people. Look at nature. Look at the natural world. And the metaphor is brought up about the earth that is brought back to life with the rain, with the rizq of Allah. No one questions that reality, even in the current time, from the believer or the disbeliever. No one questions the reality, yarhamukallah. No one questions the reality that there's a necessity for rain to come in order for the pasturage, in order for the greenery, for everything to come back after the winter. No one questions the reality that human beings will die. Matter of fact, there's a race among some people on earth to try to figure out, can we freeze the human being? Can we download the memory of the human being and upload the memory of the human being? Can we even create new cells? And can we clone the human being? There's all that type of activity that takes place. No one questions the reality of death. No one questions the reality of the cycles of nature and how they operate. But when it comes to the cycles of the life of the human being, then all of a sudden we have all this, what we say, jidal, all this back and forth on the meaning of life and on the meaning of death. We want science from one angle. We want it from the angle that we can manipulate the world and dominate it. We want to be able to extract the petroleum from the earth, turn it into gas or plastic or whatever it may be. We want to project ourselves into the skies in airplanes. We want to say we go to the moon or to this planet or that planet. But when it comes to reflection scientifically about our reality as human beings, the meaning of life, we're at a loss. So the Quran comes and says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يُجَادِلُ فِي اللَّهِ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. There's that group of people, that group of human beings. There's that type of person who argues with regard to Allah without knowledge. And we have that camp which is agnostic. I'm not sure if God exists or God doesn't exist. And there's some of them that are in that boat because if God exists, then they can't do what they want. But then there's responsibility. Then there's the other camp. Well, how can you prove that God exists? Well, how can you prove your own existence? Why should we believe you about your own? You never saw yourself when you were in the womb of your mother. The development of yourself. But now you're going to speak about things which are bigger than yourself. One human being with one intellect thinking that they can deny the reality of the existence of God. But the absurdity is that we're asked to believe we came from nothing. The absurdity is that we're asked to believe that the world moves illogically without any principles. The absurdity is that we're supposed to live a meaningless life. And we know psychologically that those that don't have meaning in their lives are more prone to depression and suicide. And they're prone to not live a life that is beneficial. Even we know at the level that those who have belief and have medical conditions, up to now, in the past it was not allowable, now it's encouraged. If they were to pray or if they would have that faith, you look at cancer patients, if they have faith, there's some sort of correlation between their belief, their prayer, their hope, their expectations, and the bettering of their condition. So somewhere along the line, we're not asked to be people that believe illogically as Muslims. The Quran is not a book that calls us just believe and be quiet and don't think and that's it. The Quran is constantly calling us to reflect. The Quran challenges us to the point that if we think that we have something better than provide or furnish something equivalent to the Quran to guide you. That challenge is there for all of humanity. And then in this call out, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is saying, you know, with regard to those that deny that there is a day of account, the Quran types the human being. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يُجَادِلُ فِي اللَّهِ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ وَيَتْبَعُ كُلَّ شَيْطَانٍ مَرِيدٍ. So that person then that argues about Allah without knowledge, they follow everything that will lead them, and everything that will lead them to their own destruction without even thinking, without even considering the end result of what it is that they take as a source of guidance. And then interestingly enough, when we move forward, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala once again is calling out to humanity and asking us to reflect upon the human beings that are on the earth. يا أيها الناس وإن كنتم في ريب من البحث. The Quran is saying, oh you people, if it be the case that you have doubts, insecurities, you're not certain about the resurrection, right? Then the Quran now, we don't have time to go into all of the details, but the Quran now calls the human being to reflect on himself and herself. And for the sake of the youth, I'll read the translation. The Quran comes now and says, if you have doubt with regard to the fact that you will be resurrected and brought to account before Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, if you think that's impossible, if you don't believe in the certainty of that, then what about the fact of your own creation? What about the fact of your own creation? That's the questioning that's put there. If you are in doubt about the ultimate rising on the day of resurrection, then know that indeed. So all of that language is there for certainty. All of that language is there for certainty. فَإِنَّ خَلَقَنَاكُم مِّن تُرَابٍ. And then it continues. We created all of you originally from dust, then from a sperm drop, then from a clinging clot, then from a morsel-like lump, destined to be either fully formed or left unformed. In this way do we make clear to you God's all-creative ability, the ability of Allah to create, the dominance of Allah over life and death. Thus do we cause to settle in the wombs of their mothers whatever unborn we so will for a stated period of time. Then we bring you forth as children, so that you may thereafter reach full maturity. Then among you are those who die young, and some of you are reduced by old age to the most abject state of life. You know, one of the things that we have to realize before we didn't have the language for it in some cases, Sometimes the ulama of hadith, they used to allude to it. Those who would lose their memory, or their memory was not exactly on point. The ulama of hadith pointed to that. And today's time we say Alzheimer's. We can be the most scientific, most knowledgeable. We can get many of the awards on the earth for intelligence, and then be reduced to no memory, reduced to not even being able to recognize our own children or our loved ones or even ourselves. And the Quran affirms that after having had some knowledge, that person will not know anything. And then the Quran doesn't stop the reflection on the human being. The Quran takes the reflection to the earth. وَتَرَى الْأَرْضَ هَادِمَةً. That's how the ayat begins. And here, the Quran is asking us to look at what it is that we see. What it is that we're seeing. Everything else that went before is not something that we see. We, in the 21st century, we take it for granted because we have, YouTube. We can watch the video that, where they put the camera in the womb. We can watch the whole process. But all of that at one point in time was from the knowledge of the unseen. There's two types of knowledge of the unseen. There's al-mutlaq wa nisbiyah. There's some things which are absolutely only in the knowledge of Allah. We can never reach that. And there's things that we say that they're from the unseen because we ourselves haven't reached that point of understanding. But we see when we reach that point of understanding is a hujjah, is a proof on us. May Allah make it easy for us. Because it's something that makes it clear to us the realities now here that the Quran is pointing to. This reality of what goes on in the womb is one of the biggest challenges that we have in this time period. Because this is not only forcing us to think about the reality of what the Quran is saying, because science itself is looking at this reality, but there's no iman behind it. It's purposeless. The miracle of life is purposeless. Although we know out of all of the sperm, so to speak, that go to fertilize the eggs, we know that it's like a miracle that one makes it through and fertilizes the eggs. We know that the probability of that is amazing. But we don't see it. We don't feel it. That our own creation, that the creation of every living being that's around us is miraculous. And the safety that has to take place in order for that life to be formed, it can go out of existence at any time. Here the Quran is moving us from that reflection of the unseen. Don't think with the contemporary mind that we have the technology to see the development of the life in the womb. Think about a time when that didn't exist. And then think about today that we have that technology, and rather than submit to Allah wa ta'ala, we continue in disbelief as humanity. We're saying not the believers. So here the Quran now brings us to the point of the earth itself, what we see with our eyes. The Quran is getting us to reflect on that reality. And even so, do you see the earth lifeless? Didn't we just see it lifeless? We're still waiting for the summertime, unfortunately. In that waiting for the summertime, which we're supposed to be in the summertime, that delay in the summertime is because of the unique reality of the human being. إِنِّي جَعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. The climate problem, ظَهْرَةَ الْفَسَادِ, corruption has appeared, right, on the earth and in the oceans and so on and so forth. And we see that. We saw that reality. That we as human beings are not stewards of the earth. We're not taking care of the earth. That's why we were all plagued with this smoke that came from Canada. And Allahu A'lam what else came with it. That's why we're discussing about the earth overheating. We're discussing about in you know what's going to happen in 10 years to the water supply on the earth. The human being is not just another animal. The human being is very unique. But here the Quran is calling us to reflect upon the lifeless earth. How it is that the rain, when it comes, it resurrects that earth. Because the Quran wants us to connect between the reality of resurrection from death and everything that we see around. The Quran wants us to believe with certainty that look at your own development, how you came from death into life. Just like you came from non-existence into existence, you will die again and then you will be brought back to life again. But that reality is not just something which you can just accept like that. You have to have a firm conviction in it. Your heart has to affirm it. Your intellect has to be aligned with it. And then again, the Quran, in a few ayat later, repeats, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَا يُجَادِلُ فِي اللَّهِ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ وَلَا هُدًى وَلَا كِتَابٍ مُنِيرٍ. That from humanity, and these examples are being given to reflect, and yet after these things are being told to the people, there's a group, a segment on the earth, there's a type of person who continues to argue about Allah. They don't have revealed knowledge. They didn't even know about themselves and their own development and their own origin. They even were not in existence at one period of time, but they want to talk about Allah. They want to talk about God. And we have to think about that. God, Allah, existed before any of us. And we have to think about hundreds and hundreds of years that have gone by, millions of human beings. They come and they go on the earth. And Allah remains. It's impossible for the world itself, the universe, to maintain itself just by itself. And it's impossible to think that we have the understanding of life completely if we ourselves in our own lives at times don't even have our own lives in order. And the Quran is giving us that key to put our lives in order, but also to gain meaning out of life so that we understand the purpose of life itself, so that we understand ourselves as human beings. But the Quran is saying that there's these people that they argue without knowledge. And lastly, again, in a few more ayat that follow, Quran gives us a warning. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى الْحَرْفِ. We talked about that a little before. And that's for us as believers. A lot what came before was to the disbeliever. But this is for the believer. Those who worship Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Those of us who we worship Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, and we're fine with Allah when everything in our lives is good. Then we're good with that. But we fall off when life becomes difficult. We have to recognize what's going on here. In the context of this surah, Iman requires sacrifice and struggle. And we unfortunately, we ran out of time, so I just wanted to make this point before closing out this part of the khutbah. That sacrifice was made with the hijrah of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, with the migration of Ibrahim. That sacrifice that Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam made, that was a family sacrifice. Hajj itself, it shows the role of the family itself in Iman. Our mother Hajj, we see that she was foundational. She was foundational to the establishment of Iman. And, we don't recognize that. We talk about Ibrahim. But we don't recognize the role of the mother and how it is that she took care of Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam. And how it is that she worked with Ibrahim, and from there they were able to build a community that was righteous. Iman means that we have to be clear on the meaning of life and ourselves, the meaning of the hereafter, our relationship with Allah. But also we have to recognize that to build the community of Iman, to preserve our values, is a family affair. The role of the women in this is extremely important, especially if the men are out in society looking for provisions of Allah wa ta'ala to establish the family. But the same thing in the masjid. The same thing with building the masjid. The women are the ones that bring the children. And the women are the ones that are the tie between the children and the husbands and the men. Our communities have to be built on this reality. If we see in this surah teaches us that it's the man and the woman in the coming together that build the family. And even there's pointing to the reality of the biological family. No matter what society is saying about who the human being is, here Allah wa ta'ala is telling us there's human beings talking without knowledge on the earth. They may gain some power for a short period of time, but they have no book of guidance. They have no sense of time, no sense of history. Their view of the earth is only looking at the here and now, but they don't look at the hereafter. And they don't think about the beginning of life. They don't think about the accountability of the human being. We as a community, we think about the accountability of the human being, that we will be judged for our actions and what we do with our lives and our time. We as a community, we believe in the revelation of the Quran and what it teaches us about the human being. We as a community believe in what the Quran is telling us about life and good and bad and so on and so forth. That's important. But in order to establish those values, people, we need security. And the first level of security has to come in our homes. Our homes, we have to be in agreement as husband and wives. We have to be in agreement as children and parents that what we do in our space in our home is uphold those values. If our home is in chaos, then how do we expect our families to continue? The other point is that we need a space that's secure. And that's the reality of the community or the reality of the masjid. And I want you to reflect upon that. Sorry for taking over the time. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, we ask you by all of your names and your attributes to forgive us our sins. We ask you, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, to accept us in these days, accept our minor deeds. We ask you to have those deeds be weighty on our scales. We ask you for all of those who are sick. We ask you, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, for those that are in Hajj, that you accept them, that you forgive them, that you return them back to us. And those that they pass away on the way, we ask you, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, to accept them. We ask you, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, for our families and our community. We ask you to protect us, to grow us, to guide us. We ask you, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, to open the gates of rizq for us, make it easy for us, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, to seek from the halal. We ask you, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, for our families, for our relationships with our children, with our husbands, with our wives, with our relatives. We ask that you make them easy, and we ask that you remove any tension that may be there between our hearts, and we ask that you unite us in Iman. We ask you, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, mostly to die in the state of Islam. We ask you to go in the grave firm on Tawheed. And we ask you, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, that you forgive us for all of our sins in this world, and that you make it easy for us as we travel to you after death. We ask the same for our children, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. We ask that you protect them when we're gone. We ask that you guide them and our grandchildren and their children. And we ask, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, that our community be a community that is the community of Iman and Dawah. Ameen. Aqimus Salah.